Right then, I think we should get started. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. My name's Tom Hyatt. I'm a senior solicitor in the employment team here at Harrington Carmichael. I'm joined by Joe, a solicitor in our team as well. Oh, I've skipped past the lovely pictures of both of us too, but we'll go back just so there can be no doubt as to who we are. So thank you for joining. This is one of our monthly webinars. Lots of you will be on our mailing list. Lots of you will have no doubt come to our monthly webinars before, so thank you for joining. We are covering the topic today of performance management and everything that relates to that topic. Um, I suspect we'll be talking for about 40 minutes or so, maybe 45. We could spend a whole hour talking about various different sections of this one webinar, so we're not going to do that. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour to performance improvement processes. But we're deliberately leaving, we'll deliberately try and finish a little bit earlier than 1 o'clock just to give time for any questions. So if you do have any questions along the way, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box. If you're feeling really brave at the end of the session, you're welcome to come off of mute and ask away as well, but there will be time for questions. Fire them away during the session. If we are going to come to that, we might just pick it up at the end, but we will try and see if we can tackle them as we go along. But anyway, before, well, let's get started. What are we going to be covering? Performance, quite a wide topic. So we're going to be really looking at effective performance management. That includes conducting formal capability process, the formal elements, some of the stages that you'd expect to see before then, what a performance improvement plan actually looks like, our top tips for putting one in place and making it as effective and as reliable and as defensible ultimately as it can be. Whenever we talk about performance management, a huge part of that is obviously disability and reasonable adjustments. I'm going to let Joe, who's a specialist in that area, cover that topic towards the end of the session. Common pitfalls, tribunal risks. Ultimately, whenever we're looking at processes, whether it's disciplinary processes, redundancy process, performance management processes that could potentially end in an employee's termination of their employment, we have to think about what are the risks here. And at the moment, anyone that with 2 years service or more has unfair dismissal rights. I suspect everyone will know by now that that's soon to change, but for now it's 2 years. So when we're looking at these formal processes, we always have to be thinking at the back of our minds of, well, if somebody's got more than 2 years service, we need to demonstrate that we're following a fair and proper process if the decision ultimately is that we bring someone's employment to an end. And then Joe's going to touch on the Employment Rights Act that's coming in, lots of new changes down the line, and specifically which ones are going to be relevant to the topic we're talking on today. So let's get started. Performance management is something that should be really on being done on an ongoing basis. A question that typically gets asked is when should we be managing performance? And the answer to that is always. We always want to be making sure that we understand how someone is performing. Whether our performance issues, the very first step that we want to make sure us as employers are aware of is, well, what is the reason for that? How do we understand performance issues? So before starting any formal, informal processes, having even a conversation sometimes with an employee, we need to be clear about what the actual problem is. It's easy to say that someone is underperforming, but what standard are they actually failing to meet? What is it that they are doing that doesn't meet the standard? And I suppose the question that follows on from that is, what is that standard? Is the standard of their performance that's been set, is it clear? Is it reasonable? Is it something that they even know about it? How can somebody be expected to meet a performance standard if they haven't even been explained what that standard is? So really, we want specific examples. Comments like, I don't know, you need to be more proactive, you need to show better leadership. That doesn't tell an employee what they're doing wrong or how they might be able to improve. It's too vague. So we have to be quite precise on what the issue is. How long has the issue existed? That's going to change how we look at a problem, how we address it, the process that we might follow. Is this a recent dip in performance? Has it been raised before? Is this an employee who was previously performing very well and suddenly has dipped? That's always going to create some red flags and make you think, well, is this really a performance issue? Is there something else going on here? Has anything else changed? I think whenever you've got an employee and their performance has just dipped, particularly if they were high performing or performing to a good standard before, you've got to think about what is the issue here? Are we asking them to do something that they weren't previously doing? Have we expanded the scope of their role? Have they had training for that? Are the instructions they're receiving clear? What's their workload like? Has that increased? Are they now looking at an excessive workload that they didn't previously have? Could it be a management problem? Has management changed? Has their supervisor changed? Are there wider problems within their team? Sometimes it might be something outside of work, and as managers and as employers, as HR professionals, that's something you need to consider. Is this something we need to have a conversation with an employee and just find out, look, is there something going on outside of work that we should know about, because we might be able to make allowances, be able to support you with that, rather than just assuming it's because they're not good enough at their job. I think most importantly, when we're looking at an underlying performance issue, we have to ask the question of, is this capability or is it conduct? Because how you address those two issues varies quite drastically. And another way of asking that question is this an issue of I can't do something, or I won't do, I'm refusing to do something? Because if it's a won't do, if it's somebody who's just more than capable of doing it, they've just decided they're not going to do something, maybe that's more of a conduct issue, and maybe that's something that needs to be addressed with an informal or even an informal disciplinary route, rather than looking at a performance management issue. If they're trying to reach a standard but they just can't seem to get there, then that's probably far more likely to be a capability issue. But like I said, if they're just choosing not to do it, probably more of a conduct issue. That last bullet point there, health or disability, can obviously be relevant, and Joe's going to be covering disability, reasonable adjustments, and the things you have to consider in much more detail later on. But it's obviously a question you always have to ask if you've got an employee who's underperforming. Could this be related to a medical condition? Could that medical condition be a disability? Do we need to be doing more? But I'll leave Joe to go in that in much more detail. Moving on then. Managing performance informally. Performance management should start as ordinary day-to-day management, in my view. Managers shouldn't just have their concerns saved up for an annual appraisal. It shouldn't be once a year or twice a year that an employee is told that there is a issue. It should be managed almost day to day on an informal basis. If there's a problem, it should be raised promptly. What should managers be doing? Well, explaining what the concern is. What is the standard expected? And this goes back to understanding the problem as well. Has that standard been explained? Can we do that informally? What improvement is actually needed? And I think on an informal basis, you should always be giving an employee a proper chance to explain. They might identify a problem that you weren't aware of in their wider team or within the business that's actually preventing them from being at the standard that you expected them. What are the type of questions I tend to ask myself here? I suppose, is there anything preventing you from meeting this objective? That's the type of question I'd probably ask an employee. Were the expectations clear to you? Do you know what you need to be doing? And finally, is there any support that would help you do that? Is there anything that, before even having to escalate this, we can offer you some support to help you achieve and be where we need you to be? In an informal process, an informal stage, I'd be trying to agree some clear areas for improvement, providing that support if it's needed. That could include training, coaching, just clearer priorities, perhaps help with workloads, or maybe even more regular feedback if that employee doesn't know what they're meant to be doing. More regular feedback, more consistent meetings could help address that. You might want to set a reasonable informal review period, have a good idea of what's been explained, make sure that they know what's going on. But I think the key point here is, if we're treating this as an informal process, there's often this expectation that, well, we still need to be documenting everything. We need to make it very formal. Even if it's an informal process, we're not going to go on to disciplinaries or written warnings. There's often an urge to think, well, we're having all these meetings, we need to write everything down. Yes, you want to know when you're meeting with what you're saying, but it's a careful line to cross. It's very easy to stray into. We think we're carrying out an informal process, but the reality is we're issuing warnings, we're issuing we're taking notes every time and we're recording this in writing, and you start to create a bit of a grey area as to, is this an informal process we're trying to use, or have we drifted into a more formal process without knowing about it? And that's why I often urge employers to just think very carefully. If you're trying to resolve this informally, make sure it is a proper informal process and we're not documenting absolutely everything and issuing outcomes. I think it's still fair to explain at this stage that if performance isn't going to improve, then it may need to be escalated, and then you might want to move into a more formal capability process. There's no harm in having that conversation with an employee to say, look, we're trying to help you here. We don't really want to have to go down a formal capability route, but it is something that we might have to consider if we can't get you to the standard we need you to be. No issue in letting them know that at this stage. Moving on then, one of the things we need to think about before we move on to a formal process is, what evidence do we actually have? I think we need to be able to evidence both the standard that's required, the standard that employees meant to be meeting, and how they have fallen short. And I know I've just said don't take minutes of absolutely every meeting. Just to clarify that, what we don't want is formal outcomes. We don't want to be writing to an employee after a meeting to say, this is what we discussed. You need to meet this within 10 days and you need to meet this objective, because that's when you're looking at much more like a formal process that we will come to shortly. But before we even think about moving into a formal capability performance process, we do need to have some evidence. We need to know what we've got available. And a lot of that you're going to have through appraisals. You'll see PIPs is on there. That might be a little bit misleading, but I left that in there deliberately to talk around, because at this stage, if this is the first time we're having to think about whether we need to proceed with a formal performance improvement process, we probably don't have a PIP in place. We're not going to have set targets and review periods in place, but there will be occasions where there might be a PIP from in the past. It might be a performance improvement process that had started previously, maybe got halfway through and actually we decided we were quite happy and the performance had improved, so we paused that. It's still relevant evidence, though, to say that there was a PIP previously in place and we had some objectives. It might be something we'd look back on, but just err on the side of caution that we are being fair and that it's still up to date. What other evidence might we have? Obviously, objectives, targets, actual missed deadlines, errors, quality in work. If you've got examples of somebody's work that is not a good standard, then that is, again, that's evidence of performance. If it's a written document, say a briefing note, a report, anything like that, obviously going to be job specific. But if you've got things like that, tangible evidence of a piece of work that's not up to the standard you'd expect, then that is the evidence you'd like to consider and perhaps start to gather to come to the decision of whether it's appropriate or not to then move to a more formal performance process. Some tips there, I'd say look for any inconsistencies. Again, if their performance has been very good consistently and they've received very positive, let's say there's been a positive appraisal, discretionary bonus or a pay rise, then we might need to think, well, what has changed? How are we going to be able to justify why, in our view as the employer, this now warrants escalation? What has changed? We're going to need evidence of what has changed, the rationale behind it. Thinking worst case scenario here, if we're in a situation where we're having to issue sanctions, written warnings, maybe even termination of employment, we're going to be in a sticky situation if there's plenty of evidence to show that this employee was a high flyer doing very well, but all of a sudden, without any evidence, we decided that we had to start a formal performance improvement process. So I think that covers off the last bullet point there, why it's important, why we want to make sure that we have evidence before escalating. Moving on then to starting a formal capability process. Look, unfortunately, as we all know, an informal process won't always work. If there hasn't been enough improvement or the concerns are just too serious to be able to manage informally, it might be time that we actually start this capability process. So if we've done what we've needed to do in terms of looking at what the evidence is, we've worked out specifically what the concerns are, what the standards are that are not being met, that's when we would be looking to move to a formal capability process. First thing to do, and this sounds like an obvious one, but it's something that we see so often neglected, have a look at your own policy. You will all know that your capability process, if you have one, if it's in your staff handbook, it's probably non-contractual. You're probably not obliged to stick to it, but you want to check that nonetheless. There's no point having policies if there are certain steps that you're agreeing that you will try to follow and do if you don't know it. So it seems like an obvious one, but also one that's overlooked. Have a look back through your policy, see if there's anything specific that your organization, your business is agreeing it will do when it goes through a capability process. Typically, what would you do after that? You'd write to the employee, you'd be explaining what the performance concerns are, you'd be explaining what the standards that they're expected to meet are, you'd be inviting them to a meeting, you'd be explaining the purpose of that meeting, you'd be explaining the possible outcomes of that meeting, and the possible outcomes might be that we're going to put you on a performance improvement process. We have to come up with objectives, which we'll come to in a moment. I'd be providing that evidence in advance of the meeting. It shouldn't come as a shock. Well, really, none of this should come as a shock if you have done your jobs well. If your managers have done their jobs well in that informal process, it shouldn't come as a huge surprise to an employee that to suddenly be invited to a meeting to talk about their performance. But nonetheless, provide them with the evidence, make sure that they have a chance to review it, understand it, give them reasonable notice, give them enough time to prepare for that meeting. And like I said, make sure that that letter reflects the possible outcomes. At this stage, under the process that you're describing and discussing, one of the outcomes is a formal PIP. At this stage, you may not want to be saying that, look, this is dismissal or this is a final written warning, because at this stage we're actually focusing more on what we're going to be starting a performance improvement process. Try and keep the language neutral. That meeting needs to be a genuine discussion, not simply confrontation or just hammering home the fact that a decision is already made and this is what we're doing. It needs to be a two-way conversation. You need to give them the opportunity to respond. And I think I've probably covered off a few of those points already on this next slide. But just to recap those and go a bit more into detail on what that meeting should look like. A formal capability meeting, again, explain the concerns, work through the evidence, be clear about what the standards are that the employee is falling short on, give them a chance to respond, give them a chance to challenge the evidence if they can or are able to, give them a chance to provide their own information. They may have their own evidence. There may be explanations. Don't go into that meeting thinking we know the outcome is going to be a PIP, performance improvement process, because you never know. This employee may turn around with completely justified reasons that would make us look very silly if we still proceeded with a PIP. So, like I said, don't go into that meeting thinking that this is a done deal, a done outcome, and we're just ticking boxes before we move on to a PIP. Make it a two-way conversation. Try and find out whether there is anything that explains performance that actually doesn't even require this process. For example, they might turn around and say, actually, these targets were never sent to me. The training that you say I've had, I wasn't in that day. I've never actually had that training. Who knows? But make sure you are listening and having that two-way conversation. I think if something important and unexpected is raised, it might be sensible to adjourn that meeting rather than carry on and making an immediate decision. And look, at this point, if anything medical condition related comes up, disability related comes up, something you need to consider, but Joe's going to cover that off in much more detail a little bit later. After that meeting, you want to confirm the outcome in writing. Normally, I wouldn't be suggesting that you give an outcome immediately at the end of that meeting. Sometimes it might be appropriate where the answer is so clear and obvious, but a lot of the time you're going to want to take some time, pause the meeting, think about what the outcome is going to be, and then write to them. And one of the outcomes is ultimately going to be that we proceed with a PIP. So what is a PIP? I've been using that phrase PIP a lot. PIP is performance improvement plan or performance improvement process, often used interchangeably. Performance improvement plan tends to refer to the actual set of objectives, a set of objectives that we are going to set, that we need to set that employee. What's the purpose of it? What's to help them improve? Shouldn't simply be paperwork that leads towards an outcome, leads towards dismissal, leads towards a written warning. It needs to identify what the concerns are, the standard required, what the objectives of this process is, how their improvement might be measured. So that's going to be realistic targets, measurable objectives, realistic deadlines as well. It's not fair to say we expect 2 weeks worth of work to be done by the end of tomorrow. It's not realistic. It wouldn't be fair to then subject the employee to that. It wouldn't be a fair or reasonable PIP. What else does it need to identify? The support available. It needs to acknowledge whether there is more support that we can be doing as employers, whether there is anything more that they might need. You remember early on I spoke about the vague and broad performance allegations, I suppose. Again, at this stage, you want to be avoiding those. You can't have an objective as communicate better or show more leadership. It needs to be more precise. It needs to be measurable. It needs to be something that tangible that you can later, if needed, make a decision on, well, was this met or not, rather than it being very subjective. If an objective can't be measured numerically or it can't be measured objectively, then make sure you explain what a satisfactory outcome would look like in practice. So in a nutshell, what are the targets need to be? Reasonable, achievable, relevant to that role, and within the employee's control as well. It's not fair to be setting objectives and targets that are entirely outside of someone's control and depend on what somebody else in the business is doing completely. If it's not somebody that they manage, if this is something entirely out of their control, it's not going to be a reasonable, achievable, or relevant objective. There's no length, no standard length for a PIP. It is going to depend on the role. Typically, how long would a PIP be for? 3 months, maybe 6 months. Again, it really depends on the seniority, the function of the role. Ultimately, the employee needs to be given enough time to show that there can be meaningful and sustained improvement. So performance improvement process that's designed to be in place for a month, I think you'd get quite heavily criticised on by the employee or by a tribunal if you find yourself having to defend that process. There's very few roles where a month is going to give somebody enough time to take on board the feedback, take on board their performance concerns, come up with their own plan for how they're going to address it, take on board any training, support, etc., and then be able to demonstrate to the company whether they've done that or not. It's quite a short space of time, and anything shorter than that is almost undoubtedly going to find yourself in a process where your PIP could be challenged and open to criticism. Be clear in the PIP about the support available, so any training, coaching, supervision, feedback. And I think if you're promising that support, then employers need to make sure that they're actually providing that. It can't just be an empty promise. Moving on to review meetings. Now, you'll see on the next slide that I'm not moving to yet deliberately. I just want to give a bit of an overview first. This isn't as rigid as a lot of employers seem to think. There are roles and there are times when 3 or 4 fixed review meetings is absolutely going to be appropriate, but there are other times when actually that's not going to demonstrate a fair or reasonable process. Sometimes you wouldn't need to carry that many. So it is circumstantial, it really depends on the role. And I think sometimes it can be really worth getting some legal advice early on if it's a challenging process or it's a particularly senior role, because ultimately you don't want to be doing far more than you need to if this is quite a black and white case of somebody's simply not being suitable for the role, and equally, and probably with more risk, you don't want to be doing a PIP that is not long enough and not giving somebody the opportunity to improve. So whilst I'm going to talk about formal review stages, you don't have to wait until each final meeting to have a catch up with that employee. If somebody is just about on track or not quite on track, there is no harm in their manager or you as HR professionals in having meetings and deviating from the strict set meetings, as opposed to have an additional meeting to say, look, let's just have a chat. How is this going? What can we do to support you? How can we guide you a bit more? But moving on then, so if a PIP has been put in place and we are moving to a formal capability process, review meetings, stage one, what does that look like? If you're going to be holding a stage one review meeting, that is the first opportunity where you're formally sitting down with the employee and looking at, has the objectives that have been set been met? Are you on track to meet those, the ones that can be measured now? Is there an outcome? Can we come to a decision? And at that point, probably providing any updated evidence in advance of that meeting, we would let them know, look, this is the evidence we're relying on, because unfortunately it suggests that you haven't yet met the targets that have been set. I wouldn't assume that we're automatically going to be escalating and issuing performance-related first written warnings or final written warnings. You need to consider exactly what improvement has been made, what the trajectory is, what concerns are still there, what concerns still remain. Again, I'd be revisiting whether the targets are reasonable, whether they're fair, whether they can be met. Consider whether the support that's been promised has been provided, whether more improvement is likely or not, or are we looking at a situation where actually any reasonable person reviewing this will probably come to a decision of, it doesn't look like this employee's performance is going to improve within the timescales. Obviously, if they've met those standards and their performance has improved, then that formal process might come to an end. It might be that you're having a stage one meeting and you're saying, brilliant, great job. We're pleased to see that your performance has improved. You've met the targets, and that might be the end of it. You'd obviously record that meeting, record the outcome, but at that point, you're probably not going to escalate it to a stage 2 or stage 3 unless there's anything else that needs to be addressed. If they've made good progress but they're not quite there yet, you might continue the PIP. You might decide that actually it's not suitable to issue a written warning at this stage because performance is on the up and it is improving, but we're going to stick with the rest of the process and we're going to carry on for the next few weeks or months, whatever the plan might have been. But if we're at that first stage 1 meeting, performance hasn't improved, there hasn't been enough improvement, typically the outcome of that stage 1 meeting could be a first written warning along with a further PIP. And that PIP might be the same as it was before. It might look exactly the same. If nothing has been met, it might be slightly modified depending on the circumstances. But typically, if those objectives haven't been met, it doesn't look like the employee is on a trajectory that we can reasonably be satisfied with. That is when you would be looking to issue a first written warning together with a further PIP. And look, if that continues, then you're likely inviting somebody to a stage 2 meeting. If performance haven't improved again, still at that point, then you're revisiting the PIP, issuing it again, potentially issuing a final written warning. And again, ultimately, you might be moving to a stage 3 meeting or stage 4 meeting, again, depending on the employee's role and the circumstances. And that's where, if an employee has got a live final written warning because of these performance concerns, then that's why you might be looking at dismissal, and that might be something that you're considering. But before dismissing, it's obviously a serious step. You need to be considered whether is any further improvement reasonably likely, is more time appropriate, is more support appropriate. Are there any other alternative roles that we could be moving this employee into? Is it that they are in a role that's just not a right for them, it's not a good fit for them, but actually this employee would be great in a different role. Do we have any vacancies across the business that this employee might be a good fit for? If there is, then we should be looking at that. And certainly if an employee has unfair dismissal rights, which then we need to be looking at other alternative roles across the business that could render their dismissal unfair, even if the performance improvement process has been fair and genuine and we have done it well. If there are other roles across the business that employee could have reasonably done and we know that they would have been okay at that job and we've just forgotten to consider it, then it raises question of, well, is this dismissal fair despite that we've done everything else right? That has reminded me a key point here, which is that when we're considering formal performance improvement processes, in most cases, the employee would have unfair dismissal rights. So as the law currently stands, it's because they've got 2 years service or more. I'm not saying that we wouldn't do it for somebody with less than 2 years service, but because they don't have unfair dismissal rights, quite often you might be looking to resolve the performance concerns at a more informal stage because they can't later challenge the performance process. And Joe will talk more about disability discrimination and why that's not always going to be the case. And you can't assume that just because somebody doesn't have unfair dismissal rights that we don't have to follow any process at all. That would be wrong. But generally, where we're not considering potential discrimination or disability issues, performance processes are required where somebody has unfair dismissal rights. Obviously, at this point, you're confirming the decision in writing at these meetings, making sure that you're giving them, telling them of their right to be accompanied at any statutory meeting or a meeting where one of the outcomes is a disciplinary sanction. They should be advised of their right to be accompanied by a colleague or a trade union member if relevant. So make sure that they've got that opportunity at each of these meetings. And lastly, offer the right to appeal, particularly if somebody has unfair dismissal rights, make sure they've got the opportunity to appeal. And the appeal doesn't mean that you're having to start again and go through a whole another performance improvement process. The dismissal is likely to still stand, but if there's anything that we haven't considered that we might have to revisit, then you should give the employee the opportunity to raise those, set out the grounds of appeal, and then address those. Like I said at the start, very much a whistle-stop tour to a capability process. I'm sure we could spend a lot of time on each one of these steps in much more detail, but we just don't have the time to do that. So I'm going to hand over to Joe to talk through the other parts. Keep putting questions in the box. I've just seen that we've had one. I'll have a read through, but I'm not going to stop you starting, Joe. I think we'll come back and answer these at the end.
Yeah, I've got a little section at the end for questions. So we'll save those to the end. If anything comes to someone's mind while we're going through, then just drop the question in the comments box. So I'm now going to cover disability considerations, which, as Tom has been alluding to, is one of the most risky areas from a legal perspective. And it's also one we encounter very regularly, where performance is potentially linked to a disability, then additional obligations can arise. So many of you will know there's no qualifying period for disability discrimination claims, unlike unfair dismissal. And at the moment, we've seen a drastic increase in the number of disability discrimination claims being brought forward. So there's been a 79% increase in the most recent quarter, second only to whistleblowing. As you can all imagine, that one is also quite popular. The pressure on the tribunal systems is also forecast to intensify as a result of the reforms in the Employment Rights Act, which we'll go on to. You might already know there's going to be a reduction in time limits, reduction in the qualifying period for unfair dismissal from 2 years to 6 months. And in terms of time limits, that's been increased, from 3 months to 6 months. So this isn't an area that's going to go away anytime soon. Now, the first bullet point on my slide is about knowledge. So knowledge of disability is key. An employer can know about a disability by being informed of it, or they can be fixed with knowledge where they ought reasonably to have known about a disability, even if they didn't say, that being the employee, that they were or considered themselves to be disabled. Managers should give a sort of consideration about whether they might know someone that is disabled. For example, is there an employee who's been on repeated sickness absence recently, or perhaps they're persistently late? Is there something there that we ought to sort of investigate. As Tom said, it's having that pause to think, why is this? What's going on? So that we mitigate any risk of discrimination. Most of you, I imagine, will find that a disclosure of disability happens during a capability meeting, which isn't always particularly helpful. And again, it's about pausing and thinking about what that means if that is something that happens. So in terms of potential claims, one that we didn't touch on previously is one we call discrimination arising from disability. So not particularly a common one, but that is really prevalent in capability situations like this. So what it means is that if poor performance arises in consequence of a disability, so it's relating to a symptom of that disability, it could be discriminatory. If we take punctuality as the example, an employee suffering with chronic fatigue syndrome might persistently be late for work, and that's caused performance concerns, for example. So we need to think about whether that is something that is arising, a symptom of that disability. So in such circumstances, an employer could potentially justify their treatment if it can successfully show that the reason for the action being taken is because it is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. The legitimate aim part tends to be the easier bit to identify. So the business reason, typically why you need an employee to do a certain thing. It's the proportionality that can sometimes be a bit more tricky. So that's thinking, actually, is there a less discriminatory way of achieving that same legitimate aim? Is there something we could do here to make sure that this person in particular is not disadvantaged? So that's where we, again, need to have some serious consideration. Reasonable adjustments. So Tom touched on this earlier. So this is an ongoing duty. Once you have knowledge of a disability, that duty is triggered. The duty arises under Section 20 of the Equality Act, and the failure then comes under Section 21 if you failed to make reasonable adjustments. But it's not to the role itself necessarily all the time. You might want to adjust duties and provide additional support, but you also might need to adapt the capability process itself. So having regard to what the process looks like and what impact it could have on a person with a disability. For example, if we have an employee with anxiety, they might need more time to prepare for the meetings that we have as part of the capability process, or they might benefit from having questions in advance so that they can prepare for them adequately. It's all thinking about, like we say, what's reasonable in those circumstances. The third one I want to touch on is sort of akin to reasonable adjustments. So it's where a policy or a provision or a criteria or practice that seems neutral actually places a disabled employee at a particular disadvantage when compared to others. So, for example, if we have a requirement that all employees need to achieve identical productivity targets, or if we've got a rigid attendance requirement, or if we need them in the office, those sorts of things, although appear neutral, can affect somebody with a disability disproportionately. It's something also to be mindful of, because typically we're all quite aware of what direct discrimination looks like, but actually we overlook things like indirect discrimination, whether that could be captured too. So it's, again, just having a look, right, what am I requiring the employee to do? Is that something that a disability could be affected by? If disability is potentially involved, again, we would really recommend just pausing the clock and thinking about actually what's going on here. We always suggest that you protect yourself with sort of layers of different evidence here. So you might want to get some medical evidence where appropriate, or obtain an occupational health report to see what reasonable adjustments might be helpful, possible redeployment like Tom touched on. We can also want to discuss those with the employee before we make any decision too. So openly communicating with them about what the problem is, what adjustment might be able to be put in place to avoid that. You also want to record your decision making as well. So again, it is really important to write as much down as possible, because in however many years' time in the employment tribunal, you're going to be there and considering, right, well, what did I say at the time? If you've got that documented, it's only going to make it easier. If we don't consider disability, it can mean that an ordinary capability matter is then turned into a more complex discrimination claim. So if we look at dismissal for capability, capability is a potentially fair reason for dismissal, one of the 5, but we need to show that a fair process has been followed. So was there a genuine capability concern? Did we tell the employee about it as well? Did the employee actually understand what was required of them during that time? Did we give them appropriate support? Did we give them sufficient time to allow for that improvement? A fair procedure generally was followed, for example, in accordance with your capability procedure, and considering any alternatives to dismissal. So dismissal should be the last resort in circumstances like this. I think it's important to note in an unfair dismissal claim, it's not about whether the tribunal would have made the same decision. It's not going to step into your shoes as the employer in deciding whether that was right. It's going to look at whether the decision fell within the range of reasonable responses available to a reasonable employer at that time. A fair process is therefore just as important as the underlying performance issue itself. Many of you might also ask, well, how long is sufficient time? Tom touched on this earlier, and as typical lawyers, we're going to say it depends on how much time is relevant, but we can look at a number of factors, as Tom said, in determining that. So looking at the nature of the role, the seriousness of the performance concerns, length of service, their seniority, whether training or adjustments have already been provided, and actually how long would it take to improve in that scenario. So, for example, something that a process or a quarter would be where something could be achievable, is that relevant there? Again, before dismissing, particularly in the context of a possible disability issue, employers should consider redeployment, alternative vacancies, potentially demotion, if that is something that's appropriate, but to be very careful with that. And again, any sort of further training or support. So if we then go on to the next slide, we'll talk again about sort of the key legal risks and the common mistakes that we encounter. So the most common one, as I said, is sort of poorly evidencing any performance concerns. If you have inconsistent treatment between employees, or you don't provide support or investigate properly, if we ignore health conditions that might amount to a disability, we set unrealistic targets or failure to consider reasonable adjustments, and the most sort of relevant one I find when dealing with capability is the employee finds or thinks that the decision is predetermined. As soon as you put me on that PIP, you were going to dismiss me. So it's making sure we can clearly document, no, that wasn't the case. So managers might have genuine concerns, but if you don't document those, it becomes extremely difficult to demonstrate them when it happens over the next following weeks, months, however long it might be. At the moment, as we said, there's a lot of pressure on the employment tribunals, and we only think that claims are going to increase. So writing things down as and when they happen is only going to help you when, like we say, in a few years, potentially time, you've come to that final hearing and you think, oh, what happened actually on so-and-so date when that capability meeting was being held. So most common claims we see, unfair dismissal, as we said. At the moment, the requirement is to have 2 years service in order not to be unfairly dismissed. That is going to change, and I'm going to go on to that in the next slide. We also have constructive dismissal. So that's where employees essentially jump before they're pushed. So they've decided, actually, your conduct is so bad as an employer, it's breached the implied term of mutual trust and confidence between us, and that breach is repudiatory, can't be fixed, and I am entitled to resign as a result. If they have 2 years service, they can also bring a constructive unfair dismissal claim too. So they can tag it on, in effect, to an unfair dismissal claim. It does make it a little bit more tricky for them to prove that repudiatory breach, but it is something we quite often see an employee considering. Disability discrimination, obviously, we've already covered that in the previous slides, but the most prominent ones are discrimination arising from disability, indirect, and failure to make reasonable adjustments. But there might be other things that are involved as well. For example, harassment. If we're making comments of, oh, you should be able to do this, notwithstanding your disability, could actually be harassment as well. So there is a huge and broad range of possible consequences that we could have. And that's why, again, it's so important just to pause if there are any questions in that scenario. So when we look at defending capability dismissals in an unfair dismissal sense, we want to show there was a good investigation, concerns were communicated, we allowed a realistic opportunity to improve, provided support and training, and reviewed progress. And if we make an outcome that's, well, any outcome, essentially we offer a right of appeal as well, including an up to dismissal. That broadly is aligning with the ACAS Code of Practice on Disciplinary and Grievance Procedures, which would apply. While a breach of that ACAS code is not in itself a claim, tribunals can take that into account when assessing unfair dismissal awards. So I would always ask my managers to check the ACAS code and use that as a minimum standard for managing capability concerns. So make sure they're aware of it. It's easy to access. You can all access it online. There is a new code of practice currently being consulted on, with the consultation for that due to end on the 23rd of September. At the moment, it looks like there are a couple of key changes. So informal resolution is now being brought into the statutory code, meaning that a failure to explore informal resolution could contribute to that 25% potential uplift in compensation. Invitation letters for disciplinary and grievance meetings must explain what informal steps have already been taken, or if there were none, why. Suspension should only be used where necessary, reinforcing it's not a neutral act. Worker replaces employee throughout the code, which widens its scope. And then there are new sections going to be introduced about reasonable adjustments, manager training, mediation, facilitated conversations, including the option to pause formal procedures while mediation, for example, is attempted. So a few more changes. If we go to the next slide, we have a new era of Employment Rights Act, a new era of employment law. Taylor Swift fans might appreciate that title there. But essentially, the biggest change we are seeing is the reduction in the qualification period for unfair dismissal. So as we said, it's important that we deal with things timely, but also noting actually, if you get 6 months service at the time you dismiss, that will be an unfair dismissal potentially, or an unfair dismissal claim potentially. The Employment Rights Act itself places a greater emphasis on those fair procedures for that reason, documentation and compliance with capability procedures. I would expect as part of all of these changes that managers are going to have increased scrutiny of the decisions they make and the records they keep. So again, making sure everything is documented, particularly when we have to think about how long it might be that we revisit this. As we said as well, limitation periods are changing to bring an employment tribunal claim. So at the moment, it's 3 months. It's going to be increased to 6 months. That's going to come into effect really soon from the 1st of October this year. So that means potential claims remain live for longer. Managers may be giving evidence about events that occurred a while ago, and that's why that record keeping is important. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, yes, unfair dismissal is going to change, but that doesn't affect me now. That could be wrong. So if you've got an employee recruited on the 1st of July 2026, they may generally acquire ordinary unfair dismissal rights by the 1st of January 2027 because they've got their 6-month period there. So actually, it's really important that we start practicing the right processes now to make sure when the new law comes in that we are ready for it, and that any performance issues are managed appropriately. It's also important in the context of probation periods. So it's quite common for an employer to have a 6-month probation period. Actually, is that appropriate now, given the circumstances? Is this something that actually could be dealt with within 3 months to assess if actually that person is right for the job or not? If you do need a higher probation period, perhaps you could say 5 months probation, making sure it's clearly documented and evidenced when you're having those probation review meetings, and any concerns are recorded then. That's only going to protect you should anything happen in the future. Early intervention, as we said, is really important. So from the first day of employment throughout the employment life cycle, we need to be talking about performance management appropriately. As we said as well, document concerns, keep accurate records, record support provided, consider alternatives to dismissal, and follow your capability procedure consistently with keeping in mind we also might need reasonable adjustments in certain circumstances. So if you haven't already, now is the time to review that capability process. If you haven't had to look at it in a little while, please do. We can help you, support you, particularly with these upcoming changes as well. So I'm conscious that we've all waffled on for a little bit longer than we said at the beginning. So if I go to the next slide, we're then going to talk about sort of questions that you might have in relation to disability discrimination and the capability process itself. Pop anything that you want to talk about, even a potential scenario, whether or not that's a genuine scenario or not, and we can discuss that now.
There are a couple of questions, and I think I must have missed them when I was in full flow talking, so I'm going to go back. A question, Kay said, I thought we had to inform an employee that if they fail to meet the required standards, that their contract might be terminated at the earliest opportunity. I'm going to assume that you probably asked this question at the point where I was talking around capability hearings. The short answer is no. At that stage, before we've even issued a PIP, we don't need to tell them that they're going to be issued with handwritten warnings or outcomes. The possible outcome at that stage is whether or not they're going to be placed in a formal PIP. So dismissal is too remote to have to be presented as a possible outcome. When you're at that stage of a PIP is in place and then we're having review meetings, at that point, yes, you do unfortunately need to be highlighting that if you don't meet these objectives, unfortunately, one of the outcomes might be final written warning, it might be dismissal. So I hope that clears that up. Ultimately, the requirement is that you need to inform somebody of the outcome of a meeting that they're going to attend. Another question, we use PIP as a tool to support an informal performance management to help ensure performance gaps and standards are expected are really clear and that the employee is being given support to improve. Would you recommend against using a PIP in the informal stage? I think there's nothing wrong with setting written objectives, offering support at an informal stage for anyone. But I think the risk in calling it a PIP and labelling it a PIP is that the employees often understand that to mean that it's part of a formal process. So I'd probably call it something different, call it an informal improvement or development plan, make clear that it's not a formal warning or a formal capability action. And at that point, you can't be saying at that informal stage that if you don't meet these targets, then we're going to issue a warning or potentially dismiss you. So in short, not an issue, but probably steer away from calling it a PIP and make sure that we're not conflating it with a formal process. There was another question in the chat box as well. I don't know if you managed to see that one, Joe. I'm going to flick over to the chat box. Is a review meeting the same as a capability hearing, or should you do a review meeting to investigate non-improvement and then invite to a capability hearing? I think everybody uses slightly different terminology, different language here, and even employment lawyer to employment lawyer probably uses different terminologies to what we call the meetings, but ultimately the labels matter a lot less than the purpose of the meeting. The process that we described and we discussed and we tend to recommend, and I suppose the terminology that we would use is that the initial capability meeting, that capability hearing, is the meeting that's used to determine whether to start a formal PIP. The following meetings, when the PIP is in place, I would tend to call them a review meeting because we're reviewing the formal PIP that's in place. So I hope that helps, a bit of a distinction between them. I think there was another question on the
We've got two more.
Do you want to tackle them, Joe?
So we've got one from Cara, just following on from your last comment about the PIP and basically try not to blur the lines between formal and informal. So Cara's asked, what if the employee has been with you for years, but due to limited capacity, you've never been able to raise anything previously? Is it ever too late to start a PIP? Short answer, no, absolutely not. You can start a PIP, but actually, are you thinking, right, is this a real performance issue, or can we tackle this informally first? So it's not perhaps jumping straight to that, taking a step back and thinking, actually, let's do an informal process first before we start then thinking about something further. Just seen one from Karen as well. We're keen. We are keen to employ learning disabilities for certain roles. However, we find you need a longer probation period, more than 6 months probationary period to understand the job. How does this affect the new Employment Rights Act? My understanding is that in future we would need to make sure our probation review is complete well under 6 months. If you've got a problem with an employee, you can still dismiss them. So although the unfair dismissal qualification period has come down, will come down, you can still dismiss for a potentially fair reason, i.e. capability, but having in mind those layers of protection when it comes to disability as well. So it's not straight off the bat going, right, that's it, predetermined outcome, we're going to dismiss you. It's, again, sort of having regard to it in the round and deciding, actually, is this what is going to work sort of long term? So you could reduce the probation period, but actually in some circumstances, would it be appropriate to do so when you've got to think about the actual disability itself and the impact it has on that individual? I don't know if you have anything further to add on that, Tom. I've just seen one more as well.
I think that's fair. There was one last question. I'll let you tackle it. It relates to potential disability discrimination.
Yeah, so we have a PIP policy that states OSP may be withheld if off sick during the PIP procedure. If an employee has put in a note in for stress and anxiety following being put on a PIP, what are your thoughts on withholding OSP from this? Would you be worried this amounts to discrimination? I think we always need to be worried about whether something amounts to discrimination, but are you doing something in consequence of a disability? Now, if the stress and anxiety is something new and is following being put on a PIP, is that going to meet the legal definition? Not necessarily, because actually this is a symptom of what has happened because of the PIP process, not of disability in itself, i.e. has it lasted 12 months? Is it likely to last 12 months? Again, treating this with a bit of caution, because there's always a possibility there could be discrimination, or if that the employee alleges that. So you could also explore, if you consider actually this is a disability and we want to make we have a duty to make reasonable adjustments, could that reasonable adjustment be putting them on OSP and thinking, okay, in these circumstances it makes sense for us to do this as a reasonable adjustment? So I am giving that typical lawyer answer, aren't I, of it depends on the circumstances and what you want to do with that particular employee. But I think there is always something that you need to be considering throughout, and just pausing, having consideration to it. And again, just sort of navigating that process with disability in mind.
Yeah, and I think just to throw in my 2 cents there as well, I often think, well, if our policy states that we would stop paying an enhanced sick pay if you go on sickness absence during a performance improvement process, our reason for withdrawing full sick pay is highly unlikely to be a disability. We're not doing that because somebody might have a disability, even if they do meet the threshold of having a disability. We're doing it because we have a legitimate, proportionate aim of ultimately not wanting people to go on off sick whilst on a PIP. So just my view there.
Yeah, I think that's the indirect discrimination point, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, look, thank you. I don't think there are any other questions. If there are, please feel free to reach out to us after. There is a QR code. If you're not already signed up to our mailer, please feel free to. We've sent out our invites. We send out weekly updates on all things employment law as well. I'm going to move on to a final slide. If you want to connect with us, please feel free to. We like to have friends and LinkedIn friends, so please feel free to drop us an ad. There are contact details as well. So if you did have any burning questions for Joe or I, please feel free to ping them over to us. Otherwise, hope you have a nice rest of your afternoon. Hope to see you again soon.